Good afternoon, culture lovers. I'm John Carter, and I'd like to welcome you to the Museum of Nebraska History at 15th and P Street, and welcome you to the next in our ongoing series of brown bag lectures. Today, our program is sponsored by the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation, the good folks that make many, many things possible that wouldn't otherwise happen, including these. It's my good fortune today to be able to make the introduction because we're going to soar with the angels. Vince Goeres had a long career as a banker and trust officer with the National Bank of Commerce. When he retired from that enterprise, he took on something really important, which was volunteering for the Nebraska State Historical Society. Vince carried his interest in aviation through many years of research, pulling together some of the most amazing stories about flight in Nebraska. And of course, Nebraska is a beautiful place to fly because there isn't anything to fly into. You can have the mountains and the forests. Today, Vince is going to talk to us about a project that we hope is going to grow into a book. And his talk today is the early aviation of Nebraska. Vince Goeres.
Thank you, John. This program is not going to be all-inclusive in terms of the history of Nebraska aviation, but highlight the wonderful pictures we have from pretty much the beginning of aviation in Nebraska through the so-called golden age, the 20s and the 30s. And we've got about 30 or 40 collections that have quite a few aviation pictures. The two best are the McDonald collection from here at Lincoln and Nathaniel Duell from Omaha, who was a commercial photographer with a great interest in aviation during the 20s and 30s. He took close to 700 pictures, which we have at the Society, of aviation in and surrounding Omaha during that period. And they're so marvelous that I have a hard time editing everything down to a show like this because I want to show everybody all of them. But we'll really start early on with a balloon ascension in 1903 in Broken Bow. This is from the Solomon Butcher collection. Hot air balloons were popular during that period, starting in the late 1890s for the next decade or so in Nebraska. And we have a few interesting slides of these. This one is at Polk, Nebraska, at County Fair in 1910. It's kind of interesting is we got a sequence of these which show the balloon getting ready to go up, smoke coming out the bottom. And you notice with the third picture there where they let the hot air out of the balloon and it comes down, and just above that big tent basically is a canopy of a parachute. Oops, sorry about that, folks. Where the balloon ascension, the pilot jumps out in a parachute. And you can notice down below that even got the horse's attention. Oops, I'm having a hard time remembering how to punch one of these. I'm a little slow at getting into modern technology. I'm used to slides. This airship, built in 1907 in Omaha by the Baysdorfer brothers, flew in Omaha, they took it to St. Louis, and then around the country to fly exhibitions. They were very inventive, especially Otto, in Omaha at that time. And in 1910, they built the first airplane in Nebraska. And I'm still trying to get a hold of a real good picture of that, which I haven't got. But they were unusual, and this is their balloon in Omaha in the early days. And here again, this is the Savage brothers in Ewing in 1911. They built several airplanes, were probably the first or the second Nebraskans to fly after the Baysdorfer brothers in Omaha. They got off the ground in 1911, as did the Morrow brothers, which I'll show you in a minute. This is the brothers in front of their airplane. It's a Curtiss type pusher. Plans for these appeared in some of the early magazines like Popular Mechanics and Scientific American and stuff like that. In 1915, I believe it was, Matt, the brother that did most of the flying, was killed in a crash, and the brothers gave it up after that. So it was a very glorious but short career for them, and they unfortunately crashed. Here's Everett Morrow in 1912. There's some question about whether the Morrow brothers got off the ground in 1911 or not, but we know they were flying a lot in 1912 in Carlton, Nebraska. And we don't have a lot more about them, but Everett did some reminiscing with an old friend in the 1950s, and we have a copy of that. He ended up being a steeple, building high chimneys and repairing them later on in his life. Here's a Curtiss pusher, which flew in Omaha and Lincoln in 1910. Curtiss actually came to Omaha in that summer and made demonstration flights and helped the Baysdorfer brothers when they were building their airplane. This is one of his pilots that went around the country giving air shows. They made money that way, as did the Wright brothers. A guy by the name of Huxley came to Lincoln for the state fair as a Wright brothers pilot and flew his plane at the state fair in that year. So this is kind of the beginnings. This is an aerial photograph of the state capitol in 1915. It's not high quality, but considering what went into getting it, it's a pretty good picture. The National Guard had a couple guys, Captain McMullen was the man who took this picture in 1915, it is. He took this one and one of the state pen and the fairgrounds. There's a state pen at the same time. He basically had his own airplane and did demonstration flights and barnstorming around to support the activity, which became part of the National Guard. He did some experimental bombing and picture taking for the National Guard, but with the coming of World War II, that unit just kind of got wiped out somewhere along the way. McMillan was killed in Kansas that year on one of his demonstration flights to raise money for their operations. Orville Ralston's kind of a forgotten man, and I'd like to keep bringing his name up so people don't forget him completely. A Nebraskan, was going to dental college when World War I started, entered the Army Air Corps at the time, trained in Canada and in Texas and in England, went over to France and flew with a British squadron for a short period of time, and then later with the American squadron. He's the only Nebraskan that was an ace, that has shot down at least 5 airplanes during World War I. He came back to Nebraska, finished dental school, and practiced dentistry in Nebraska, went back in the Army in World War II and was crashed and was killed in an airplane crash, unfortunately. Here's another early Lincoln airplane. The Lark, manufactured by Harding, Zook and Ball in 1919 and 1920. Cute little airplane. The fuselage is monocoque construction out of laminated plywood, which was a very pioneering type operation during that particular period. Harold Ball did most of the flying. He later on, in 1922, took Lindbergh barnstorming in May of 1922 around southeast Nebraska. Lindbergh got his start as a wing walker and a parachutist and ticket seller and mechanic and overall flunky for Harold Ball at the time. Harold Ball was a very interesting history. We haven't got time to talk much about him, but he was killed in an auto crash in 1930, unfortunately shortening his aviation career. The man on the right is Ensign Chambers. That's a de Havilland JN4. Chambers at the time was a sergeant in the Army. He was an aircraft mechanic, started parachuting, set a world record for parachuting in Kansas City in 1922. He later joined the Lincoln Standard Aircraft Company and eventually became plant manager and a director of the company. In 1922, his parachute record was 26,800 feet. And for those early days, that's a long way up and a long way down. Here he is on the wing of the DH-4, getting ready to jump. Here he is flying through the air in one of his early jumps. This isn't a record jump so far as we know. But he was in Lincoln for a lot of years and left a significant collection to the Historical Society of his activities while he was here in Lincoln in aviation. This is really the first successful manufacture of airplanes in Lincoln. The Lincoln Standard Tourabout. Basically, it's a World War I training plane, a Standard. 3 Lincoln men in 1919 bought basically the whole surplus supply of these airplanes after World War I. They went belly up rather quickly, and Ray Page took what was left of it over and began manufacturing these airplanes. They were basically the surplus airplane, which they re-engined to a much better engine, made the cockpit up in front so it'd hold 2 people, and made several variants of it with longer and shorter wings to do a variety of things. This is the type of airplane that Lindbergh learned how to fly in 1922. This is at the field out on South 20th Street, west of the Country Club. The building in the background appears to be, and I'm almost certain is, St. Thomas Orphanage. Some of you may remember that. It's now Bishop Square in Lincoln on South 27th Street. Here's the Lincoln Standard LS3, a slight modification of that early model. Very pretty airplane here again on South 20th Street. They also at the time came out with a kit plane which they sold to people that wanted to build their own airplane. The Lincoln Standard Sport. A very little teeny thing, 16-foot wingspan. If anybody knows where that building is in the background, I'd sure appreciate finding out. Otto Timm came to Lincoln at about the time Ray Page took over Lincoln Standard and became their engineer. He was an early aviation pioneer, pilot, aircraft builder. And he designed this airplane. Here again, it's a modification of early Standard with a Hisso engine in it and a front cockpit that was designed to take 4 people in an open cockpit setting. Ira Schleininger is the man on the right there. He later held seniority #1 for pilots in American Airlines. Lincoln boy. Born in Moorhead, Nebraska, actually, but eventually moved to Lincoln. Here's that same airplane, 2 of them, sitting in front of the hangar when the airfield was moved to South 14th Street, just south of the, at the time, graveyard out there, Lincoln Memorial Park, and now the area where their new chapel, etc., is, and mortuary out there is where this hangar and field was. This was an attempt to start an early airline down through Wichita and the Southwest. It never really got off the ground, but they gave it a shot. Very interesting little airplane and early try. Here's a Lincoln Page, late 1920s. Victor Roos came up from Wichita. He had been an executive in a Swallow Aircraft Company down there. He was originally out of Omaha, mention him a little bit later. And he brought the plans to a Swallow along, a Laird Swallow. They modified it a little and called it the Lincoln Page. And they built and sold quite a few of these aircraft. I wish I could give you a good number, but I can't. Their manufacturing facilities was at 24th and O. That building still stands. Here they're welding fuselages together. They also, in the late 20s and early 30s, designed another little more modern airplane called the Lincoln Page, AP, here for all-purpose cabin plane. Came with two different engine configurations, radial engines, a Kenner at 100 horsepower and a engine at 125. This plane was, here again, zapped by the Great Depression, anything ever really came of it. They also came out with a Lincoln Playboy, which is a little teeny thing, struts going back from this abbreviated fuselage to hold a stabilizer and a couple fins. That's Victor Roos and his wife in the airplane at the time. Nothing ever really came of this one either, unfortunately. The Great Depression really zapped a lot of these airplanes. Roos eventually merged this company in 1931 with a company in Kansas City, and the facilities were moved down there, and it disappeared by about 1936. Here's a quick move up to Omaha, and we'll concentrate on Omaha for a few minutes. This is the Exarban or Airmail Field. That intersection down there by the big hangar is, I believe, 63rd and Pacific, or Center, excuse me, where the old Exarban, there's still remnants of that left up there, but Exarban, of course, has changed a lot with horse racing going out in recent years. There's a airmail hangar there and a private hangar just off the strut of that wing there, where a man came to Omaha named Adamson, who built engines and built an airplane called a Bluebird. But he died, unfortunately, in 1920. His wife ran the business until this field was closed after a severe storm destroyed the airmail hangar, and the airmail moved to Fort Crook. This is the field at Fort Crook. This is 1931, so quite a bit's going on between when they started there and they finished, but it's kind of an interesting aerial view of what the field looked like at the time, and of course some of the quarters of the military that stayed there. This is the airmail field at North Platte in the mid-1920s. North Platte was, of course, a major stop on the airmail route, flying from Chicago to Omaha to North Platte to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and then on to Salt Lake in California. Here's the airmail field, or Exarban field, before the storm. That's a de Havilland DH-4, which was the principal airmail plane in the early 20s. They were huge numbers of them in surplus, and if one crashed, they just hauled out another one and never worried about it. They had surplus engines the same way. They didn't do a lot of repair work on engines. They just put a new engine in because they were so cheap. The beginning of better airplanes for the airmail, this is a Douglas M2 up in Omaha. That was a pretty big, bulky airplane. You can see the big housings for night lights for landing at night, which they were working with. Here's a very interesting Omaha airplane. This is a Blinka cabin plane built in 1922. Victor Roos was in partnership with Giuseppe Blinka. They built this airplane up there. Some say it's the first cabin plane in this country. Very nice looking little airplane, way ahead of its time. He couldn't get financing to keep making it, so he folded his tent and went back to the East Coast, where he did get financing and built a number of airplanes through the 20s and 30s. Lindbergh tried to buy one of his airplanes in 1927, and they couldn't come to an agreement on it. So Lindbergh went to Ryan out in California to have the airplane that he crossed the Atlantic in built. But Giuseppe Belenka got started in Omaha with his building airplanes, and unfortunately Omaha wasn't able to keep him. Here's another Omaha-built airplane called the Overland Sport, built in 1929 by a fellow by the name of Funstedberg. Had a airplane company up there. Had a pal by the name of Phillips that designed this airplane. Their first one crashed because it went into a flat spin. Fortunately, Dutch Miller, the pilot, was able to parachute out of it, but the plane was lost. They made some modifications to it so that it would not go into flat spins and started producing them. But here again, the Great Depression came along and they went out of business. Omaha got back into the building of airplanes in a big way at the beginning of World War II at the Martin Bomber plant, actually in Bellevue. I think most people keep saying Omaha, but it's strictly at the old Fort Omaha and Offutt Field, named after Jarvis Offutt, a Omaha boy who was a World War I pilot, but killed in a crash in France during World War I. But they built quite a number of these planes in Omaha, and then converted over to building B-29s in Omaha. And here's the first one coming out of the hangar in Omaha. The Enola Gay and its sister airplane, the Boxcar, dropped the first 2 atomic bombs in history and on Japan. This is the Enola Gay in the Pacific. Just before or just after its bomb run, we don't know for sure. But it was right at it because that big R was painted on the rudder, I believe, the day before their bomb run, so it's a very concurrent picture. Back in Lincoln again, an airplane crash, and that may be Lindbergh with a cap on next to the man with the Panama hat. It kind of looks like him the way he built and stood, but we have absolutely no proof. But that may have been Lindbergh when he was here in the spring of 1922 learning to fly. Here he is with his pal Lindbergh, pal Bud Gurney. That's Harlan Gurney, really. Bud was a 16-year-old at the time, working part-time at Lincoln Standard Aircraft, became friends of Lindbergh when Lindbergh showed up here. Otto Tim, who I mentioned before, is a semi-airplane designer and engineer as well as a pilot, took both these boys for their first airplane ride after they'd helped him assemble a Lincoln Standard. Bud Gurney also parachuted with Lindbergh after Lindbergh got a parachute, which he took in lieu of getting to fly solo that he had paid for, but couldn't come up with a bond that Ray Page wanted before he'd let him take up a plane solo. So Lindbergh never sold while he was here in Lincoln. But he and Bud Gurney became good friends, barnstormed together, flew the airmail from St. Louis to Chicago together. Bud Gurney ended up as a United Airlines pilot, did the initial flight coast to coast for United with a 707 jet. So that's really from the beginnings to modern flying that a lot of these pilots of that particular era saw. And Bud and Lindbergh remained lifelong friends. We have some very interesting reminiscent letters from Bud Gurney to Mrs. Abbott, who was Ray Page's wife in these early days. And they reminisced, and they're really fun to read about his memories of early Lincoln. Here's Lindbergh as chief pilot for Robinson Aviation. And here's Bud Gurney as a United pilot, probably very near retirement. After Lindbergh's flight in May in 1927 to Paris, he did a round the United States tour with his airplane and then around Central America, actually. He landed in Omaha on this tour, but not in Lincoln. Here he is at, he may have remembered that Page wouldn't let him solo. I don't know what the reasons for not landing in Lincoln. He flew over, but, and threw a note out the window, but didn't land. Here he is landing in Omaha at what has become Epley Field. Here he is in front of his plane in Omaha. Unfortunately, commercial photographers, or fortunately, they quite often date their pictures, which is a real big help. Back in Lincoln again, this is Havelock, 1928, an Aerosport plane partially designed by Johnny Moore and initially built by Johnny Moore. And Johnny Moore was into the late 1927-28, was president of the Aerosport company. The Woods bought him out and wanted to produce this plane in mass production and got a pretty good start, built, oh, depending upon what count you take, 110 or 112 of these in 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, but here again, the Great Depression killed this little airplane off. Here's a really good picture of it, a side view. The early ones had a slightly different fin and rudder configuration, but this is how the plane ended up. This is the plane that's hanging in the Lincoln Municipal Airport terminal up above, and you can see it anytime you go through the airport out there. A Dr. Cram owned the one out at the airport, restored it, flew it around quite a bit, ended up selling it to the State Historical Society Foundation, but actually he gave the foundation $5,000 at the same time, and Lincoln Business Interest apparently came up with the other 10 to pay him $15,000 for it. And it was well worth it because it's really a historic aircraft for Lincoln. Here's a kind of a front view of the airplane out at Aero Airport. And this is the old Aero Airport hangar on North 48th Street, basically end of the street, city dump, and ended up taking over this. At the time, there were lakes right north of this field where a lot of Lincoln people had hunting rights and did a lot of duck hunting out there. I learned to fly at this field when I was in high school. Rode the bus out to the end of the line at 48th and Fremont, and then I'd walk or hitchhike to the airport to get my flying lessons. Here's the inside of the factory and shows the wings. The one on the right's the top wing, and the one on the left is the bottom wing, and that big open gap in there is where the ailerons went. This plane didn't have ailerons on the top wing like so many planes do, but very large ones on the bottom wing. Here's the fuselage, welded steel construction, under construction at the factory. And you can see here on the very lower right-hand corner that McDonald put dates on virtually all his pictures and is real help. Aircraft tried to produce an airplane in the mid-30s powered by a Ford V8 engine. They could, because these were being mass production for autos, they could modify them slightly and use them in an airplane, and they thought it was going to really cut the cost back, and they could produce an airplane that would sell quite cheaply and be reliably powered and get engine repairs quite easily. The airplane was never really successful. Some pilots claimed it flew like a brick when the engine quit. Was not real easy to handle, but was a great attempt, and basically Lincoln's last attempt that I know of to mass produce an airplane. I think one of the problems that aircraft had was that they dreamed of mass producing an airplane, and so they would set up to build 200, 250 airplanes and buy all the parts, etc., mass produce and one thing or another. That didn't come about, and so they ended up with significant losses on these airplanes. But it's a very interesting history, and Lincoln can be very happy with it. Here's more Lincoln history. This is the building at 24th and O, 1929. The bottom sign says Lincoln Aircraft Company, and that's the outfit that built the early airplanes we looked at a few minutes ago. Early on, there was a Lincoln Auto and Tractor School there also in the early 1920s. E.J. Sias was one of the early principals, eventually took it all over, began converting over to training airplane mechanics and pilots at about this time. It was always a separate corporation from Lincoln Aircraft, and so I think later on, as they claimed to have been the people that taught Lindbergh how to fly, I think it's mostly advertising hype. But the history is a little bit foggy in there. But E.J. Sias did go on to run Lincoln Airplane and Flying School, taught hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of mechanics and pilots during the 30s and early 40s. Here it is, the picture at a later date. Lincoln Aircraft is gone, and it's Lincoln Airplane and Flying School, and quite a successful operation during that particular period of time. E.J. Sias was, in his early days, a minister, a Chautauqua speaker, one heck of a salesman, and did a real good job of getting this company going. Here's the early Lincoln Municipal Airport, Lincoln Airplane Flying School's hangar, some of their airplanes, and the municipal terminal in the early 30s. Let me see how we're doing on time so I don't run over here. Back to Omaha. Omaha had, being kind of at a crossroads of the Midwestern part of the country, and the early Offutt Field at Fort Crook was kind of a center for aviation. In 1924, the Army took 4 airplanes like the one you see up there, a Douglas round-the-world flyer, started out in California, flew west around the world, successfully. At least 2 planes made it. The first one crashed up in Alaska, but they kept on going, and these guys made it around the world, and here they're in Omaha on their way back to California to complete the flight. It was quite an operation at the time, and Nathaniel Duell was on the scene to take a lot of good pictures of them when they were in Omaha. Here's an early French Breck airplane called the Erne, a plane that the Stirling Expedition used to go to New Guinea to explore that basically unexplored island at the time and find native tribes that were virtually the first white men that were ever seen by them. And these guys were it. They had to leave the airplane there, which is long gone, but when it was in Omaha, it was a very interesting, rather an ugly looking airplane in my opinion, but France managed to really do some pioneering in aviation, but also their artistic ability, I think, went into paintings rather than beautiful designs, because they weren't always very pretty. Here's more aviation in Omaha during that period. Edsel Ford, to promote aviation, started reliability tours where airplanes flew all around the country, stopping at major airports wherever they could find them. This is a Waco, which was a very popular aircraft builder in the 20s and 30s, probably the most successful of them all during that particular period of time, and it's on the reliability tour. Another bit of Omaha. This is on Carter Lake. This is the de Havilland Moth, a plane that really an amphibian. Here it's with the floats on it so that it could land on water. The idea was for sportsmen to use this airplane to get in and out of lakes in like Minnesota and Canada, so they could do fishing in pretty virgin territory. Here it is on land. Here again, Nathaniel Duell was on the spot to take a really lot of good pictures of this particular airplane. Here's another one. This is a Lockheed Cyrus. Somebody wrote Vega on there, which it's not. And they spelled McCready in half a dozen different places in newspapers at the time. He was an Army pilot, and he and another Army pilot were returning to Colorado, I believe it was, at this time, landed at Omaha. McCready had crashed his airplane in the Chicago Air Show and was injured rather badly, but able to be a passenger at least on going home, and we got a very picture of this very modern airplane. This design, there were only 8 or 9 of them built, but it's designed that Lindbergh, with his wife Ann, used to do their major exploration in the early 1930s. This is the one they flew the northern route over to Japan and China, and they also then later took it and flew into South America and up into Greenland and Iceland, exploring for Pan Am mostly to set up passenger routes. And Lindbergh was a superb pilot, and his wife became a superb pilot, navigator, radio operator, and they did this early exploring as a team. And of course, they were both great writers. So anytime you can get a hold of their book, if you're interested in aviation, read them, because they're superb writers and really did some very courageous exploring in our days. Here's a mono-pup at the Omaha Municipal Airport. It says Amos and Andy in the Orpheum Theater. Undoubtedly early aviation advertising. You can find ads in the Omaha paper at this time about Amos and Andy being in Omaha. So I couldn't resist the picture. It's a cute little airplane. Here's an Ogden Osprey. I've never been able to find out much history of this airplane, but it's very rare tri-motor in early days, water-cooled engines. This is the only really good picture I've ever seen of it. And I've never been able to find out a lot about the history, but I keep working on it on this particular airplane. This is in Omaha again at the Municipal Airport. And here's a picture of Omaha Airport, but Seidels Aviation Corporation of Lincoln and KFAB, which they were interested in. You can see on the hangar there it says Omaha Legion Airport. The first hangar at the Omaha Airport was built with funds raised by the Omaha American Legion. And they were having trouble raising the money until Lindbergh landed there, and then they were able to get the rest of the initial $25,000 that they put together to build that first hangar. Subsequent hangars were built very quickly, with Boeing building a big hangar, 1931. Here's a Boeing B-80. It followed the B-40, which was a single-engine biplane. Boeing built 13 of these airplanes, and they were used for the early mail route. This picture is, I believe this one was taken in Lincoln, but we've got some great pictures of it in Omaha. Kind of a unique airplane, phased out within a very few years, but did come into Lincoln and Omaha during those early days. I'm now down to the close to the end with a few women in early aviation here in Nebraska. This is Ethel Ives Tittleson. She learned to fly at Norfolk, Nebraska, and just as she was about to get, and they eventually issued it, her pilot's license, she was killed in the crash in Norfolk. Out flying solo, coming in for a landing, probably stalled out in a landing and a turn, as can happen to a beginning pilot pretty easy. At the same time, Louise Tinsley Miller was learning to fly in Omaha, and she went on to quite a flying career. We have some letters that she wrote to the State Historical Society talking about some of her early days in aviation, which are quite interesting. And we have the author here in the audience at the moment. She wrote a great book about Evelyn Sharp, very young girl, learned to fly. And she received her commercial license at age 18, the first woman to do that. She went on to fly in this particular airmail promotion picture. She taught some of the young men to fly as we got ready to enter World War II, and she then eventually ended up ferrying military aircraft around the country and was killed in a crash of a P-38, which was a twin-engine big fighter plane at the time in World War II, and so her really outstanding life was cut off rather early. But those are three of really early women pilots that we've got some good pictures of. There were several earlier than that, and we've got a lot of them since then, of course. But the first two pictures I showed you were the first two licensed women pilots in Nebraska, so far as we know. And then Evelyn Comelin later and got her license also. So that really is kind of the end of the show. I'm open to questions for anybody that would have any. Yeah.
Jack Knight on that first airmail transcontinental night flight, did he go into Exarban Field then? Is that where
Yeah.
they land? Okay. I didn't know where that.
Yeah, and we've got great pictures of Jack Knight and all that, but that was going into Exarban Field. 1921 was the first airmail across the country as an experiment. In 1924, early July, they inaugurated the service as a regular service and used bonfires the first time around, and then they put these light towers all across the country so that they could do the night flight from one light tower to the other about 15 miles apart and get across the country that way. Jack Knight was one of the early airmail pilots.
And then the picture of the municipal airport, is that where, okay, there were like two buildings. There was a hangar, and then there was, I don't know, maybe a terminal building or something. Is that out there where our municipal airport is now?
Yeah, the question was about the picture of the municipal airport with the hangar and the administration building. And that's at the site of the current Lincoln Municipal Airport and what was the Lincoln Air Force Base, very active during World War II and closed down and opened up again during the Cold War as an airport for the Army Air Force, and the B-47 bombers were there in the 60s. So it's got a very interesting history and one of the really long runways in the country, over 2 miles long.
Vince, was there ever passenger service in the early 30s, taking 2 or 3?
Yes, the question is whether there was passenger service in the early 30s.
In Nebraska.
The Boeing B-80, which was used by Boeing on the airmail route, and then the B-40 before it. The B-40 could carry about 4 passengers and a few sacks of mail. It was mainly mail, but they would carry passengers, and we're trying to get into the passenger business. The B-80 was really their first attempt at that. And they introduced stewardess in the early 30s at the same time on those airplanes. We've got some great pictures of some of those first stewardess that were on the B-80s in Omaha. The airmail didn't come to Lincoln until 1928 in B-80s. And then apparently the B-40s were the first ones, and then the B-80s came a little later on than that.
What do you think of the idea of bringing back your old airport as it was in the 20s and 30s?
Well, I think it would be interesting. I don't know whether it could be done or it would be economically viable, but it would be nice. The land is still there. I guess mainly city dump now. I haven't been out that way for quite a while. The old Lincoln, the early municipal airport, which was Union Airport north of Havelock, that's of course an industrial park now. The original 2 hangars are still out there, and the light tower is still out there. But it's an industrial park now.
I knew that Lindbergh had received his training or learned to fly in Nebraska, didn't he? Lindbergh went to school here to learn to fly. But he must have come back and spent quite a bit of time here otherwise too then.
Lindbergh? No, Lindbergh, basically when he left Lincoln, he was gone for good. He was here in the early spring, learned to fly, went barnstorming in May with Errol Ball, and did wind walking, parachute jumping, engine repair, ticket selling, the whole thing with him. Came back to Lincoln and hung around for a month or two as best we can tell. Then went with a man by the name of Lynch, barnstorming, a guy out of Kansas that bought a Lincoln Standard airplane, and went barnstorming throughout Kansas, western Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, ended up in Montana, and went back to Minnesota from there, and eventually down to south, and bought himself a Jenny, a JN4, and finally soloed in that, and then barnstormed in that, joined the Air Force, or the Army Air Corps it was, in 1924, and got really good training, learned to fly bigger and better airplanes, and went on to be an airmail pilot, but we have absolutely no evidence that he ever returned to Lincoln. But there's a lot of stories about Lindbergh, but you try to trace him down. He had to move about every other day, I think, if he lived in as many places as I've been told he lived when he was in Lincoln. So, you know, a lot of great stories, but I'm not sure about the truth of many of them.
You mentioned that he maintained a correspondence with Ethel Abbott, so they became friends when he was here and then they stayed friends, or did I misunderstand?
I have no evidence of that.
Oh.
Bud Gurney, whose picture I showed,
Oh, okay.
wrote to Ethel,
I see. I'm sorry.
and also wrote a letter to the State Historical Society when there was, in the 70s, a man down there who was trying to collect some aviation information. But he wrote a real nice reminiscing letter to Ethel, and she apparently was quite involved with her husband Ray Page in managing the operation during the 20s.
What's your status of your book now? Is it early 1900s to what year? And are you going to include World War II air bases of Nebraska?
The book you're talking about that we're trying to put together, that pretty much is going to close out with World War II. In my personal opinion, the really interesting part of aviation in Nebraska took place during those early years. And from then on, it's just like the history of any state in the country. We'll be putting some stuff about that later period in the book, but not a great deal. You can't ignore the SAC Museum and that type of thing, and so we'll certainly cover that. But it's going to be principally about the early days and principally about the collection of pictures we have at the State Historical Society, because that's really what we're going to try to emphasize, and so it's not going to be a completely all-inclusive history. We're not going to, other than maybe mention McCabe out in Lexington, and if you're interested in old airplanes, in Lexington, this county museum out there has an airplane that was designed and built by a guy by the name of McCabe in the early part of the teens. And it's out there, and a very interesting plane you can really get real close up to and look at. It's an unusual design. It's a biplane, but the wings come together at the tips, kind of making it almost an elliptical shape if you look at the airplane from the front. And this guy went on to a very successful career inventing all sorts of things beyond flying.
Was Lincoln and Nebraska, were they particularly pioneers in early development, or was the same development going on throughout the country?
I kind of missed that question. As you can tell, I'm very horribly hard of hearing. Let me.
Were we a hotbed of development here in Nebraska particularly, or was it?
Oh, this was going. No, this Nebraska was not necessarily a hotbed of development. No, this is going on all over the country. People were building airplanes and getting to fly them. Kansas, if you look at that, they went on to some real successes in Kansas. Wichita was really, a lot of people consider the cradle of aviation as far as manufacturing goes. Beechcraft started out down there. Cessna, Boeing put a big plant there later on. Laird built some of his airplanes there in the early days. A lot of really early pioneers. In Kansas City had a couple of airplanes early on. But you can go back to New York or New England and or the South, anywhere. It was going on all over the country. Okay, won't keep any longer. Thank you.